Okay, so we are forecasting a very strong rebound in global GDP this year of 5.3%. And that will actually bring global GDP back to its 2019 levels, real GDP, in late 2021. But the pace of the recovery is going to vary greatly across regions. So Asia and North America, particularly the US, the main driver there, will recover the fastest. And both those regions, we are forecasting growth of around 6%, 6.1%. And real GDP will be back to 2019 levels in those regions. China's obviously an exception because its success in containing the pandemic meant that it was the only country, G20 country, along with Turkey, that did not record a recession last year. And we're forecasting growth of 8.5%, real GDP growth in China this year. The recovery in Europe will take longer, and in Latin America, in the Middle East and North Africa region, and in sub-Saharan Africa. And that will stretch into 2022 to recover to 2019 levels. And as you said, Daniel, the rollout of the vaccines will really condition economic prospects this year and beyond. And production constraints mean that global immunization timelines will stretch into 2023 and beyond in many developing countries. And that really will weigh on the global recovery, the strength of the global recovery. And it will also create opportunities for variants to emerge that may prove resistant to current vaccines. Now, we haven't seen that yet to any serious degree, but that may happen. So that's the kind of global outlook, and we can dig a bit deeper into Europe and Greece if you like.
Well, I'd like to do that, but first of all, I just want to ask you about, I mentioned inflation and the fact that in America in particular, things seem to be running very, very hot. You see it in everyday things everyday transactions, whether it be, the price of hiring people. Very difficult to find labor now in many sectors in America. You see it in simple things like hiring a car. There are even shortages of long delivery times for a lot of goods. The supply chain has not operating as smoothly as you typically expect it to happen in America. So all these are signs of inflationary pressures in the economy. What's the forecast for inflation, and what do you think the main, perhaps the most important price in the world, the Fed's interest rates? What are the chances that will create a shock sooner than expected, rippling around the world?
Yeah, well, this is a big debate, obviously, among economists and forecasting institutions at the moment. Is this a temporary spike in inflation, which is obviously going to run through this year, or could it be longer lasting? So our view, I guess, which is kind of the kind of consensus view, not to underestimate the risk, but that this is not going to be more than a temporary spike, and that this is really being driven by base effects because of the pandemic, the supply chain disruptions that you talked about, the oil price, and so on. And so we don't want to minimize the risk, and it's something we really need to keep an eye on. And obviously the danger is, given the very large rise in public debt in the developed countries, that we might see a premature monetary policy tightening, which would then cause very serious problems for a large number of countries in terms of debt servicing. So I don't want to be sanguine about this, and probably inflation is already running above the kind of expectations that economists had.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to sort of necessarily say that the consensus is wrong. Of course, the consensus can be wrong, but I think one has to admit, surely, that the degree of money creation that there's been in the world has been so extraordinary that anybody who says with confidence that
Yes.
this is all okay, we don't have to worry about it, everything is going to settle back down to a
Yes.
world where we have low inflation. Certainly people with grey hairs like me who remember inflation back in earlier periods have to be somewhat concerned that this could come back, and that we've simply forgotten what inflation is like when expectations really get unmoored and things start to get on a vicious cycle. So that, I don't know, as you say, it's a risk, but we have to be mindful of, I suppose.
Yeah, and that our assumption also is that even in the face of even faster acceleration than we are forecasting, that the ECB and other institutions will not be tightening monetary policy anytime soon. Obviously, I'm not talking about interest rates, which is no longer, which are negative and which are no longer the main instrument of monetary policy, but QE. The QE programs that have been in place. Obviously, we're going to get more guidance, forward guidance from the ECB, but we don't see any abrupt ending of.
I'd like to get a few before we move on to our next to our opening full session. A sense of the view of Greece from the EIU. What's the forecast?
Well, clearly the pandemic really disrupted Greece's recovery from the decade-long sovereign debt crisis. Essentially, it reversed the gains that had been made since 2017. And there was a very sharp recession, not the worst in Europe. It was a contraction in real GDP of 7.8%. We are forecasting a strong rebound of 5.4% growth this year and 4.3% in 2022. So real GDP in Greece will be back to 2019 levels at some point in 2022. And that reflects in part our expectation that the EU recovery funds will lift output as the government gradually withdraws the support for households and businesses that has been in place. So a strong recovery. I mean, the main thing for Greece, obviously, and the big risk is that Greece is very exposed because of its very high dependence on external demand for services exports, for shipping and for tourism, which represent a very significant percentage of the Greek economy, around 25% for tourism, including indirect effects. So that's always going to be a continuing risk for Greece, given what we're saying about the pandemic. It's not over yet. There will be a third wave, and the question of how that impacts the economy really depends on the state of play with vaccinations. And at the moment, in Greece, 38% of the population are fully vaccinated, and the government is seeking to reach a target of 70% by autumn. And that is really critical for Greece to avoid further lockdowns and restrictions. So there is a risk of a resurgence of infection rates in the winter. Another risk for Greece is a rise in insolvencies, accompanied by a rise in non-performing loans, and that could weigh on banks' ability to lend. We can discuss the public finances, of course, with the Minister, Staikouros, but Greece remains under enhanced surveillance by Eurozone creditors, and that will require the government to bring the public finances back under control and to implement difficult reforms in the coming period. At the same time, the inclusion of Greek bonds by the ECB in its pandemic emergency program means that a lot of liquidity has been provided to the economy, and that's kept financing costs down. And even though Greece's public debt stock is the largest in the Eurozone in percentage of GDP terms, ultra-low interest rates have really minimized the financial risks in the short term. And I think the medium-term challenges are going to be much greater.